On September 27th, a tragic and heartbreaking development unfolded. Investigators discovered Rebecca roughly 12 miles from Casey's residence. The location was a secluded stretch of highway, tucked away in a remote area at the base of an embankment, a place not easily visible from the road and unlikely to be stumbled upon accidentally. There was no sign that anyone had tried to conceal her by burying. Instead, it seemed clear that someone had deliberately transported her to this isolated spot, left her there, and then quietly going away. The scene suggested a chilling intent to abandon without care or remorse, deepening the sorrow surrounding her disappearance. Rebecca Gould was born on April 28, 1982, in the peaceful and close-knit town of Melbourne, located in the state of Arkansas. Growing up in a small community like Melbourne, after finishing high school, Rebecca took the next step toward her future by enrolling at Northwest Arkansas Community College. This decision led her to relocate to the city of Fayetteville, a larger and more vibrant area where she could pursue her studies and experience greater opportunities. During this time, Rebecca began considering transferring to the University of Arkansas, aiming to further her education and work toward her long-term goals. By September of 2004, Rebecca was 22 years old and looking forward to the beginning of a new academic semester. Just before classes resumed, Rebecca and her sister decided to take a short break from their busy schedules. They planned a relaxing weekend back in Melbourne to spend some quality time with their family. On Sunday, September 19th, the sisters made the drive back home. Later that evening, Rebecca made plans to visit her boyfriend, someone she had been seeing for some time. The next morning, she was expected to pick up her sister so they could return to Fayetteville together, as they had traveled in Rebecca's car. However, when she didn't arrive as planned, her absence was immediately noticeable and concerning. At first, her family hoped that perhaps she had simply decided to stay an extra day and had forgotten to inform them. But as the hours passed, and no one was able to reach her by phone or confirm her whereabouts, concern quickly turned into worry. Rebecca's mother, sensing that something might be seriously amiss, decided to contact the local police to report her daughter as missing. The authorities began looking into her recent activities and soon learned that Rebecca had spent the night at her boyfriend Casey's home. Officers spoke with Casey and asked about the last time he saw her. According to his account, Rebecca had dropped him off at the cafe where he worked around 8:30 in the morning. She told him she planned to return to his house, pack her belongings, and then meet up with her sister so they could head back to college. He also mentioned that she had agreed to pick him up from work later that day, but she never arrived. After waiting for her in the parking lot for some time, Casey eventually left with some friends to attend a small gathering. The police carefully listened to Casey's statement and then requested permission to search his home, which he granted. Upon arrival, the first thing officers noticed was Rebecca's car still parked outside, a detail that raised immediate questions. Inside the house, they found her purse, which contained her identification and personal items, as well as her pet dog. In addition, a small suitcase Rebecca had brought with her appeared to be missing. It had now been over 24 hours since anyone had seen or heard from Rebecca, yet her belongings remained at the house. Officers continued to examine the home and observed that the mattress on the bed looked out of place. It lacked any bedding and seemed poorly positioned. When they lifted it, they noticed discoloration that appeared suspicious. Continuing their inspection, they discovered similar discolorations on the floor and parts of the wallpaper. There were also numerous bottles of household cleaner, particularly bleach, found around the home. This suggested that someone had recently tried to clean certain areas extensively, which only deepened the mystery. Despite efforts from law enforcement and the support of the community, Rebecca's whereabouts remained unknown at that time. Although investigators conducted a thorough search of the residence, they were unable to uncover any additional physical evidence that could point definitively to what had happened to Rebecca. At the time, they couldn't confirm whether the substance actually belonged to Rebecca, as forensic testing and DNA analysis required several days to produce results. While forensic specialists continued examining the scene, officers began focusing their attention on Rebecca's boyfriend, Casey. Given that he was likely the last known person to have seen her before she vanished, his actions and statements were now under close scrutiny. There was also the undeniable fact that a significant amount of what appeared to be blood was discovered inside his home, where Rebecca had last been known to stay. During questioning, Casey firmly denied any involvement in Rebecca's disappearance. He told detectives that the last time he saw her was on the morning she dropped him off at work, and from that moment on, he had not seen or heard from her again. According to him, after finishing his shift, he met up with friends for a social gathering that lasted well into the evening. Later, he returned home briefly to change clothes before heading back out for another shift. Throughout the conversation, he maintained that he had not noticed anything unusual in the house. No visible red stains, no strong chemical odors, and nothing that would have raised any suspicion in his mind. They didn't immediately accuse Casey of wrongdoing, but they also didn't accept his story without question. At that point, they lacked concrete evidence to classify him as a suspect, so their approach remained cautious but vigilant. In an effort to verify his timeline, officers interviewed the group of friends who had reportedly spent time with Casey on the night of Rebecca's disappearance. Those individuals confirmed that he had been with them throughout the evening and into the following morning, effectively providing an alibi for the time frame in question. As the investigation continued, Casey brought up the name of Rebecca's former boyfriend, Justin. He suggested that detectives might want to consider whether Justin had any reason to be involved or might know something helpful. Taking this suggestion seriously, the authorities attempted to get in touch with Justin. However, when they first tried reaching out, they couldn't locate him. He wasn't at home, and he wasn't responding to phone calls. This raised some eyebrows, especially considering his sudden unavailability coincided with the same time frame as Rebecca's disappearance. For 2 days, Justin remained unreachable, adding another layer of mystery to the unfolding situation. Then, unexpectedly, he contacted the police himself. He told investigators that he had been out of town during the entire period in question, spending time with his father at a casino. This alibi was carefully examined, and authorities were able to confirm through witness statements and surveillance records that Justin had indeed been out of the area at the time. Soon after, detectives received a new lead that helped piece together more of the timeline on the day Rebecca vanished. Through the help of surveillance footage and witness interviews, they discovered that Rebecca had made a stop at a nearby gas station shortly after dropping Casey off at work. There, she purchased a breakfast sandwich and was recognized by gas station employees, who remembered her clearly. The timestamp on the footage aligned with Casey's account of when she had left him that morning, just after 8:30 a.m. Further supporting this was the discovery of that very sandwich, still untouched, in the house she had returned to. This suggested that she made it back to Casey's place, but never had a chance to eat. It also narrowed down the time frame during which something may have happened to her. The investigation took another major step forward when the results of the forensic testing finally came back. The red substance found in the house was confirmed to be Rebecca's. Furthermore, no other foreign DNA was detected in the samples, meaning no new suspect was introduced through the evidence. This raised more questions than answers. If Rebecca had suffered some kind of harm in that house, and there were no signs of anyone else being involved, then who was responsible? And how did it happen? Then, on September 27th, exactly 1 week after Rebecca was last seen, there was a heartbreaking development. Investigators located Rebecca approximately 12 miles away from Casey's home. The discovery was made near a quiet stretch of highway, in a location that was not easily visible from the road. It was a remote area at the base of an embankment, not somewhere someone would typically come across by chance. There had been no attempt to bury or conceal her. It appeared that someone had simply transported her to the spot, left her there, and driven away. Though law enforcement now had confirmation that Rebecca's disappearance had taken a tragic turn, the mystery of what happened during those critical moments between her last known sighting and her discovery continued to haunt both the investigators and her grieving family. From what investigators could determine, it seemed likely that Rebecca had been harmed shortly after she returned to her boyfriend Casey's house that morning. Given the tight time frame between when she was last seen and when she stopped communicating, authorities speculated that whoever was responsible had likely known her schedule in advance. This led to one unsettling but increasingly probable theory, that the person had been watching her movements and waiting for a moment when she would be alone. Adding to that theory was the fact that there were no visible signs of forced entry at the scene. Nothing appeared broken or tampered with, and the locks had not been damaged. That strongly suggested that Rebecca may have willingly allowed the person inside, which further supported the idea that she knew her visitor. Investigators also concluded that whoever was responsible had likely stayed inside the house for an extended period after the incident. The presence of a strong chemical odor, specifically bleach, along with numerous empty bottles scattered around the property, suggested that a significant cleanup had been attempted. The effort to sanitize the scene seemed both methodical and time-consuming. Based on the condition of the house, authorities believed that the individual spent several hours scrubbing surfaces in hopes of removing DNA evidence. Following this, it was believed that the person had managed to transport Rebecca using a vehicle, most likely hers, which was still at the scene the next day. They likely drove to a secluded stretch of road located roughly 12 miles away and left her body at the base of an embankment. The area was hard to spot from the highway and not commonly traveled, which is probably why it took days for her to be found. Strangely, there had been no attempt to cover or conceal her, raising even more questions about the perpetrator's mindset. Despite all these deductions, the investigation was stalled by a frustrating reality. There was virtually no solid evidence pointing toward a suspect. The theories were built on logic and circumstantial details, but nothing could directly tie anyone to the crime. The lack of eyewitnesses, surveillance footage, or physical evidence such as fingerprints or foreign DNA left investigators in a difficult position. They expanded their efforts, casting a wide net that included not only friends and family of Rebecca and Casey, but also acquaintances, co-workers, neighbors, and even individuals from surrounding towns. Over time, police received dozens of tips from locals, many of whom suggested people they personally suspected. But these tips were often based on little more than personal opinion or neighborhood gossip. Despite their volume, none of the leads generated anything actionable. As the months dragged on without progress, the case went cold. Although it was never closed, momentum had slowed. New detectives were assigned in the following years as the case was reopened multiple times, each fresh team hoping to bring a new perspective or uncover previously missed details. The primary issues were the same: no clear evidence, no witnesses, and most frustratingly, no discernible motive. It remained unclear what had prompted such a devastating event. In time, the case began to attract the attention of people outside of law enforcement, particularly those in the true crime community, who often delve into unresolved cases in hopes of uncovering something new. One such person was a journalist named George Jared. He had followed the story closely from its early days and remained deeply invested in uncovering the truth. Years later, George crossed paths with Jennifer Buchholz, a former counterintelligence officer with the United States Army. Like George, she had taken a personal interest in Rebecca's case. Recognizing their shared passion for justice, the two decided to collaborate and pool their efforts. Together, they created an online group on Facebook, where they could share findings, discuss theories, and engage with others who followed the case. The group quickly gained traction among true crime followers and amateur sleuths alike. Within a few months, George and Jennifer began noticing one particular member of their Facebook group who stood out. His name was William Miller. There were two things about him that immediately struck them as unusual. Miller was living abroad, in the Philippines, and wasn't just a passive observer. He was highly active in the group, frequently commenting, asking questions, and sending private messages directly to the admins. Miller expressed a strong desire to help solve the mystery. What raised red flags, however, was the depth of knowledge he appeared to have, not only about the case itself, but also about the geography of the area where it happened. George and Jennifer didn't want to jump to conclusions, but they agreed that something about Miller's behavior warranted closer attention. They decided to quietly monitor his activity without alerting him to their growing suspicions. One day, another group member, an expert in genealogy, offered to look into William Miller's background. Using public information available from his profile and other digital breadcrumbs, she performed a routine check to see if there was any known connection between Miller and the people involved in the case. What she discovered was unexpected and potentially significant. William Miller was related to one of the key individuals connected to the investigation. Through her research, the genealogist confirmed that Miller was a blood relative. He was Casey's cousin. After the surprising revelation about William Miller's family connection to Casey, George Jared and Jennifer Buchholz knew they were looking at more than just an over-involved stranger online. The strange coincidence couldn't be ignored any longer. They made the decision to reach out directly to the investigators still assigned to Rebecca cold case. They presented the detectives with all of their findings, including Miller's unusual online behavior, his detailed knowledge of the crime, and, most importantly, his familial tie to Casey. Once George and Jennifer brought Miller's name to the forefront again, officers went back to the original case files and discovered something startling. William Miller's name had in fact been present in the documentation from the very beginning. He had already been spoken to back in 2004, shortly after Rebecca's disappearance. As the records revealed, Miller had been visiting the area from Texas at the time of the incident. He claimed to have traveled there to assist another relative who was dealing with some personal matters. During that visit, he admitted to stopping by Casey's house twice. The first visit happened 2 days before Rebecca vanished, and the second occurred the very next day. On that second occasion, he reportedly didn't even step inside the house. Digging deeper into Miller's past, investigators began to uncover a series of troubling patterns. While nothing had been proven in court, William Miller had a documented history of disturbing allegations. In 2002, 2 years before Rebecca's disappearance, he had faced charges related to an alleged assault involving a minor. Not long after that, he was accused of entering his ex-wife's home without permission. Though serious, both incidents ultimately resulted in no formal consequences. For one reason or another, Miller never served time or faced significant legal penalties in either case. Eventually, he moved overseas to the Philippines, where he started a new chapter of his life. He married, started a family, and found employment working on offshore oil rigs. His relocation made it nearly impossible for American law enforcement to bring him in for additional questioning. Years passed. Then, in 2020, something changed. U.S. Customs officials notified Arkansas authorities that William Miller had re-entered the country. He had returned to the United States and was now back in Oregon, reportedly staying with his mother. This was the first time in over a decade that detectives had a real opportunity to speak with him again in person. Wasting no time, officers contacted his mother in an attempt to locate him. However, when they reached her, she claimed she hadn't seen her son and had no idea where he was, despite multiple signs indicating otherwise. Convinced that Miller was hiding nearby, the team traveled to Oregon. When they finally located him, they brought him to the station for questioning. Leading the interview was Detective Mike McNeil, one of the experienced officers involved in the reopened investigation. He chose to begin the interrogation in a non-confrontational, almost routine manner. He told Miller that they were simply re-interviewing individuals who had been mentioned in the original case, just to ensure nothing had been overlooked. Miller appeared relaxed at first and responded calmly, stating that he was willing to cooperate and had no problem answering questions. Then, McNeil casually asked whether Miller would be open to taking a polygraph test to help confirm his statements. At that moment, everything changed. Miller's demeanor shifted noticeably. He hesitated, asked follow-up questions, and even tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. McNeil picked up on this nervous energy right away and decided to apply gentle pressure. Pretending to make a phone call, the detective said a polygraph specialist would be arriving at the station within the next half hour. This subtle bluff was meant to increase psychological tension. Miller, growing more uneasy, asked whether polygraph results were admissible in court. The detective replied vaguely, implying that under certain circumstances they might be, but without going into detail. In truth, polygraph results are not typically allowed as evidence, but legally, police are permitted to use misdirection during interrogation. Despite his discomfort, Miller eventually agreed to take the polygraph. The results, however, were not in his favor. According to the operator administering the test, Miller failed every key question related to the case. At this point, Detective McNeil decided to take a more direct approach. He told Miller that forensic analysts had recently re-examined samples taken from his vehicle and found traces of Rebecca's DNA. In 2004, police had searched Miller's car, but they hadn't collected any forensic samples at the time. There was no such DNA match, but McNeil was using a common and legal interrogation technique designed to elicit a reaction. Upon hearing this, Miller fell silent. The atmosphere in the room shifted. No longer defensive, Miller now seemed overwhelmed. The detective continued, saying that the evidence they had was strong, and the best thing Miller could do was to be honest. Then, unexpectedly, Miller broke his silence. He began to speak, slowly at first, claiming that he had not harmed Rebecca. Instead, he told a confusing and implausible story. According to him, on the morning in question, he went to his cousin Casey's house and walked inside, only to discover a stranger, a masked man, standing over Rebecca's body. He insisted that the man had already harmed her, and that Miller had nothing to do with it. Detective McNeil listened carefully, but didn't believe the story. Miller continued to avoid direct answers, until suddenly, and without further prompting, he paused and said something that changed everything. Looking at the detective, Miller said quietly, "I'm sorry for what I did." Those words would mark a turning point in a case that had remained unsolved for over 15 years. According to William Miller's own account, the morning of Rebecca's disappearance began with a seemingly ordinary activity. He said he had gone out hunting in the wooded area not far from his cousin Casey's home. While walking through the forest, he suddenly recalled that Casey's girlfriend, Rebecca, was likely at the house. For reasons he couldn't clearly explain, he felt compelled to go speak with her. Miller said he approached the front door of Casey's home and knocked. When Rebecca answered, he told her he needed to use the telephone. She let him inside without hesitation. After all, she knew who he was. Once inside, he pretended to make a call. Meanwhile, Rebecca returned to the bedroom, likely thinking nothing of it. Miller described he became overtaken by what he described as uncontrollable rage. He couldn't explain where it came from or why he felt it, only that it was sudden and overpowering. That's when he saw the piano leg, an ordinary object turned into something else in his mind. Without warning, Miller walked toward the bedroom with the intent to harm her. What happened next, by his telling, was a moment of irreversible consequence. Afterward, Miller said he wrapped Rebecca in a sheet and carried it out to his pickup truck. He placed her in the back and returned to the house, where he began attempting to clean the scene. He admitted to using bleach on the floor, the walls, and even the bedding in an effort to erase any trace of what had occurred. After he got into the truck and drove to a remote area along a nearby highway. There, he left her Rebecca beneath an embankment, out of view from passing cars. Detectives listening to the confession were struck by both the level of detail and the emotionlessness with which it was delivered. They asked the obvious question: why? What had motivated him to do this, especially to someone who had done him no harm? Miller's answer was both chilling and vague. He said there was no specific reason, only a sudden, overpowering urge that he claimed he couldn't control. Following this confession, Miller was arrested and extradited from Oregon to Arkansas, where he would face official charges. However, once in custody and aware of the legal process unfolding, Miller changed his story. He retracted the entire confession and declared himself innocent, creating a major complication for the prosecution. By U.S. law, especially in cases lacking physical evidence, a confession must be presented before a judge and clearly reaffirmed. Without it, or any supporting forensic evidence, a conviction could be challenged or even dismissed. To make matters worse, there was another procedural issue. During Miller's initial arrest, the officer who apprehended him began reading his Miranda rights, but was interrupted mid-sentence when Miller asked a question. Despite these complications, the judge ultimately ruled that Miller's recorded confession could be used. The court found that he had spoken voluntarily and was not coerced. Furthermore, Miller had opportunity, knowledge of Casey's schedule, and had provided a timeline that lined up precisely with what investigators already knew. The judge determined that there was enough consistency in his confession to consider it reliable. One aspect of the case that still raised eyebrows was that Miller had every chance to avoid prosecution entirely. When detectives first contacted him in Oregon, he was not under arrest. At that point, he was free to walk away at any time. With no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, Miller could have refused to answer any questions. He could have left the police station, returned to the airport, and boarded a flight back to the Philippines, where extraditing him without hard evidence would have been virtually impossible. But Detective Mike McNeil, who led the renewed investigation, believed that Miller had made contact with the Facebook group and law enforcement not to evade justice, but because he wanted to confess. His behavior in the group, his repeated messages, and his in-depth commentary all pointed to someone carrying the weight of a secret. This belief would later prove accurate. In 2022, Miller officially changed his plea and entered into a formal agreement with prosecutors. He confessed once again to the murder of Rebecca Gould, this time in court. As part of the deal, he received a 40-year prison sentence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was a sense of closure in the case. However, the story took another unexpected turn. While serving his sentence, Miller began speaking to prison staff and authorities about other crimes. He claimed that Rebecca had not been his only victim. According to Miller, over the course of his life, he had taken the lives of 5 more women. He said he couldn't recall all their names, but described the victims in general terms. He claimed to have selected them based on appearance, young women, typically petite in stature, with light-colored hair. Authorities took these new claims seriously and reopened several cold cases in areas where Miller had previously lived or worked. So far, no direct evidence has confirmed his involvement in any of the other alleged crimes, but investigations remain active. To this day, there are still people who question Miller's guilt in Rebecca's case. However, none of these arguments have been supported by verifiable facts. In the eyes of the law, Miller remains the person responsible for Rebecca Gould's death. The confession he gave in court, coupled with his consistent timeline and knowledge of the case, has left little room for doubt in the official record.